I'm Adam Taylor. I'm a wood products extension specialist. I don't know if people are familiar with the extension system, but there are county agents in every county in Tennessee that are there to assist farmers and landowners and the general public with matters mostly agricultural. And if those county agents have a particular question on a particular subject matter area, they call the specialist. So there's a specialist in poultry and swine and many other topics, and I'm the wood products specialist. So if someone has a question about what their logs are worth or what species of wood that is, that kind of thing, then I'm the resource for that. One big one is this old barn or log cabin that I have, is it made out of the American chestnut? Because that was a very common species before the blight, and people are excited if they think that maybe their old building has got some chestnut in it. Chestnut has a relatively high value because of its scarcity now, but in the past we had other wood species and a lot of them weren't chestnut. So distinguishing chestnut from some of the others is a common one. And then another common one, which I think is maybe relevant to the discussion today, is I've got this big tree that's dying in my front yard, and it's big and beautiful, and it should be worth a lot of money. And I have to kind of break the news to them that in the commercial system of logs and lumber that we make, and very common in Tennessee, that log is probably not worth the effort of bringing it to the sawmill. Well, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, they can go through their county agent or they can deal with me directly. To do wood identification, I need a piece of wood. It's really not possible most of the time to look at a photograph and tell what wood species it is. Wood identification depends on looking closely at the wood anatomy, the particular cells and their arrangement in the wood, and you really need to have the wood in your hand to do that. So I get people to send me a small piece of the wood, and I can identify it from that usually. Well, first I want to say that the timber industry in Tennessee is really big and really important to our state's economy. Something on the order of $20 billion worth of economic activity, and something about 3% of the state's economy is directly related to forestry. So it's really one of the top states in the country in terms of the relative importance of wood in our state. So as you travel across Tennessee and you see all these trees, about 50% of the land area is in forests in Tennessee. That's the basis, the raw material for a very important industry. Now that said, it is a hardwood industry, and there's a basic dichotomy in the wood world between hardwoods, which would be all the broad-leaved, generally deciduous trees that are most common in Tennessee, and the softwoods, which are often referred to as pine in this part of the world because that's our dominant softwood species. But they're very different trees. They grow in different areas. We don't have much softwood in this part of the world, in this state, so we're really a hardwood state. And in the wood world, hardwoods generally are used for appearance products, things that go inside your house, for example, like cabinets and flooring and millwork, whereas softwoods generally get used for structural purposes. So the actual framing of the house may be made from pine 2x4s, but the decorations on the inside, the cabinets, etc., would be made from hardwoods. It's actually remarkably diverse, the products that come from the trees in our forests. And you asked me before about the species that are important, and I missed that. But we have hardwood species here, the most common of which are the oak group. And we have something like 30 species of oak, a lot of red oaks, that's a group, including a species called red oak, and a lot of white oaks, including a species called white oak. So that's the basic division. Those species don't get further divided, but our most common species are the oaks, red and white oak, and then yellow poplar would be the third. But we use another probably dozen commercial species. They're relatively less frequent, but they still get used in many cases. But beyond that, there are many tree species that we don't use because either they're not common enough in our forests to be worth focusing on, or the size and form of the tree isn't suitable for the standard wood products that we make. So poplar and the oaks, hickory, gum, those would probably make up 80 or 90% of the production from our sawmills. Well, first I'd like to begin with just the truism that things are worth what people the value that they put on them. So they're worth what someone is willing to pay. And if you've watched a tree grow up in your yard for your entire lifetime, you might be willing to pay to have that lumber milled into a piece of lumber that you could make into a piece of furniture that would really have sentimental value to you. And that's priceless. But what I'm going to refer to is the existing commercial system where loggers go into the forest, harvest a number of trees in one area at one time, and take advantage of some of the economies of scale. When you are harvesting a single log from a front yard, it's going to be very expensive. However, in the commercial system, there are things like the logistics, the cost of hauling, that come into play as being relatively important. And the commercial system is based on a logger setting up a job over a number of acres where they will harvest at least hundreds of logs. And that makes the average cost per log in terms of delivering it to the mill, makes it quite low. In addition, there are often characteristics in a log that's growing in the open in someone's front yard that are going to greatly reduce the commercial value of the log. So while it might have sentimental value, and that shouldn't be discounted, in the commercial setting, it probably isn't going to be able to pay its way to the sawmill. So in the commercial system, logs are evaluated on a number of factors where the details are quite intricate, but the principles are relatively simple. So the first and foremost is, I mentioned before, this dichotomy between hardwoods and softwoods. And there are exceptions that go both ways. But whether the wood is going to be used for structural framing, in which case the piece is evaluated, the piece of lumber is evaluated as a whole piece and only for its structural characteristics, whereas hardwoods generally are evaluated based on their appearance. And the logs are evaluated, therefore, on their ability to produce this lumber that has a nice appearance. So I'll start at the end of the chain and work my way back into the log. So we have a board here. First of all, this is hemlock. It's a softwood. So generally speaking, if it had a commercial place, it would be on the structural end of things. But it can also be evaluated, or at least used as a demonstration for how we would evaluate a hardwood board. So if you ever go to a hardwood sawmill, you'll see a person at some point in the processing chain who is grading the lumber, and they will also probably be tallying, or someone in the mill will measure how much. So the grade is a measure of what the quality of that board is, and the tally is a measure of how big that board is. So this stick helps them to do some of the math that's involved. And again, the details of evaluating or grading hardwood lumber are very intricate, but the basic principles are that in order for a board to be of the high grade, the board itself has to be relatively big. So the lower grades, the board itself can be smaller. For the higher grades, the board has to be larger. So this board is big enough to be a good quality hardwood board. The species is unacceptable because it's a softwood, but we can still look at it with our hardwood eyes and try and evaluate what the quality of this board would be, or the grade. The other basic principle, in addition to the fact that the board has to be of a sufficient size, is that there has to be, because hardwoods are expected to be remanufactured into smaller pieces of wood that will be used for furniture or flooring or cabinets, the board has to offer those pieces. It has to have what they call clear cuttings. So if we look here, there's a piece of wood between the knots that could be called a clear cutting, because the clear cutting can't have knots and other defects, but knots are the most common consideration. As the board quality, potential board quality increases, the total surface area of that board that's available in clear cuttings increases. So a better quality board has more area of clear cuttings. It's more complicated than that, because as the board quality potentially increases, there's a limitation on the minimum size of these clear cuttings and the maximum number of clear cuttings that you can take in order to satisfy the total yield. But as a basic rule of thumb, you might be getting, say, 80% of the board or so in a top quality board available in clear cuttings, 2/3 in sort of the medium grade, and then half, and so on down the grades. But again, to repeat, the important characteristics in the grading of hardwood lumber, or appearance grade lumber, is going to be the size of the board, has to be big, and then it has to be free of knots and other defects. And the more free of those defects it is, the potentially higher value that can be. And in the hardwood world, a little bit better quality makes a big difference in price. And that basic concept of paying a lot for value and looking for large boards that are relatively clear, we can transfer that into the log. And so if we see the log over here, and you go to a sawmill and see them buying their logs, and a lot of times in this part of the world they'll buy so-called gatewood at a sawmill. So you can bring an urban tree to a sawmill if you could be able to haul it. But they'll bring in a bunch of logs, the logger will, and those logs will be evaluated and paid for based on the evaluation. So the things that go into the evaluation of the quality of a hardwood log are going to be the same things that affect the quality of a hardwood board. And that is the size, because a bigger log can provide bigger boards, and the quality. And all logs have defects in them, but if you look at the length of the log and the bottom of the log, and you see a relative abundance of knots and other defects, then you know that the lumber that comes from that log is going to be relatively low in quality. So it's a bit of an art, and every mill does it a little bit differently, but if you go and you see them grading, one of the first things they're going to do is measure the diameter at the small end of the log inside the bark. And they may often have one of these sticks. These sticks are basically just a calibrated ruler that allows them to measure the small end diameter, and knowing the length, they can then determine the so-called board footage, or an estimate of how much lumber will come from that log. Then they combine that with some rules that their mill has about the number of defects, often expressed as clear faces. So if you look at the log and divide the outside of the log into 4 equal width, full-length sections, those would be called the faces, and you might count how many of those faces don't have any apparent defects, like a knot or something else. This log, for example, has bird peck, where the woodpeckers have gone around. That can be considered a defect. But it's easy to get lost in some of the details, but just remember that the size, expressed primarily by the diameter and to some extent the length, are going to be primary considerations, as well as the clear faces, or the amount of defects. This ruler is just a way to measure the size, which impacts both how much they're going to pay, because you pay by the size, and also help determine the grade, because small diameter logs will automatically be disqualified from some of the higher grades, even if the appearance otherwise is okay. So we measure inside the bark from one side to the other. This log is 22 inches in so-called scaling diameter. So that would be at the small end inside the bark. That is large enough to satisfy almost all the criteria for quality and acceptability at a commercial sawmill. In fact, many urban trees are too large to fit into the commercial systems, because these very large oak trees that grow in your yard will get too big for the commercial sawmilling equipment that is meant to handle usually logs of 30, 35 inches and smaller. At the opposite end of the scale, commercial sawmills generally won't be interested in a log that has a scaling diameter inside the bark at the small end of 10 inches or less. But, the hardwoods are sorted by species, and there's an inherent very large difference amongst the species. Now, cherry is generally one of the top quality and top value species because of the nice appearance of the wood. Other top species include walnut, and right now white oak is very valuable. Species like the other oaks, red oak, are sort of medium in value. Might include hickory and maple too in there. And then things like gum and poplar are going to be sort of on the lower end. So first of all, they need to know the species, and often they're brought in as a mixture of species, and that'll be one of their first considerations, is what species do we have. So we have potential for high value here, because cherry is really one of the higher valued American hardwoods, and valued throughout the world. That's one of the things I'd like to point out, is that American hardwood is like the Cadillac of woods in the world. It's really we got a great reputation based on the inherent wood quality, the species that we have, and also the fact that we're legal and sustainable. That's becoming increasingly important in the global marketplace. So about half the wood that gets sawn in our sawmills of the good quality wood goes overseas to some foreign destination or other. But the process of putting the value to it is first identifying the species. So that gives us, in this case with this cherry, the potential for high value. But this is going to be disheartening to find out that this tree, again, you might have grown up with it all your life, and you know, it's cherry and it has a good reputation, but we're going to find out it's not worth very much in the commercial sense. So we identify the species, we got to measure the length, and length is usually measured in feet, more or less on the even feet. So anywhere from 8 to 16, usually in even numbers. So this log is a little over 15 feet, but it would get scaled out or valued as a 14-foot log. And knowing that it's 14 feet, I can then measure the diameter using my little rule here, and it uses the Doyle log scale, which is the common rule around here, to estimate the amount of useful lumber that will come from this log. So if I measure, this has different rows of numbers for different lengths of logs. So I've got the 14-foot row on the back side of this ruler. I can hold it up against the small end of this log inside the bark, and I come up with 88 feet. So the Doyle logs rule is estimating that I'll get 88 board feet of lumber from this log. Lumber is measured in units of board feet, which is a piece of wood that's 1 inch thick by 12 inches wide by 12 inches long, or any other combination. So it's a volume measurement that is used, the standard commodity, and often that gets expressed in terms of 1,000 board feet. But this log has predicted to have 88 board feet. Now the Doyle rule deliberately underestimates, and that's another story, but that's the basis upon which the prices are set. So 88 board feet. So we've got 88 board feet of log that the sawmill is going to pay for, but what they have to do is figure out how many dollars per board foot, how many cents per board foot they're going to pay, and that will be a function of the species and the grade. So species is cherry, and as I mentioned, that's one of the relatively high priced species. But the other thing we have to look at is the size and the defects to determine the grade. The size is okay, 14 inches, that's pretty good, and the length is satisfactory. So then we have to look at the characteristics of the log that would influence the quality of the lumber coming from that log. I mentioned the 4 faces that you break it up into. Well, this is a branch stub grown over. There's very likely to be some rotten wood inside there. So this is a big defect that's going to cause some serious problems in terms of the yield of lumber. In addition, you can see that this log has been dead for a while. It may have been standing dead and it's starting to decay out in the sapwood. Actually, in cherry, that's a relatively less important problem, but it can often be a problem that in urban trees, they're often already infested with decay fungi or insects, which will decrease the potential value. But it depends on which sawmill and how they're doing it. But overall, I would give this log a sort of medium rating, and that might get a different name at different sawmills, but for a medium rating, we might be paying something on the order of $500 per 1,000 board feet of scaled logs, just as a wild guess. So if we had 88, that means it's 50 cents per board foot, and if we have 88 board feet of scaled log volume, that means this log would be worth $44 to the sawmill at the gate. So you got to get it there, which is going to probably cost you something. So it's really not worth much. Now, if this is your tree that you swung from as a little child, you might want to pay someone to mill it up into lumber and make you something that will help you to remember the history of that tree and what it meant to you. But in the commercial reality, it's not worth much. Well, it seems to, if anything, to be growing, but it's very much a niche market. So the commercial reality that we have in Tennessee, or the dominant commercial reality, is that the lumber is a commodity material. It's totally interchangeable. So if you create some cherry lumber of a particular grade and a particular thickness, that can be sold anywhere under that description. So like potatoes or tomatoes or something, it really doesn't matter where they go. The price will be the same based on those characteristics. However, with that reclaimed material or urban lumber, the niche is having something special about that particular piece of wood. either its unique appearance or its unique history or something like that, that the customer is really willing to pay for. And therefore, it makes economic sense for the miller or the furniture maker or whatever to deal with that piece of wood particularly. Well, we had indication when looking at the log that it had a lot of defects, and that would lower its commercial value. But now that you've got it opened up and you start to see some of the defects, it brings to my mind the conversation that often occurs, which is what's a defect and what's a character mark? And they really are the same thing. So in this case, this little knot here wouldn't be allowed to be in the clear cuttings that I was talking about before when we're grading hardwood lumber. On the other hand, you might look at that and reasonably say, that's beautiful and I want it in my piece of furniture. But the way the commercial system works is it only looks at these clear areas and it does not allow this to be in there. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and if you find that beautiful, then custom sawing is one of the ways that you can take advantage of the character marks that exist in abundance in urban wood. Yeah, well, there's a couple things that come into play. One is that difference between hardwoods and softwoods. Hardwoods, they're going to take that board and remanufacture it into smaller pieces for furniture and cabinets, etc. Whereas softwoods, the lumber that gets produced at the sawmill is going to be used, generally speaking, in its full size. The other thing that comes into play is that lumber is sawn originally when the wood is still wet. And during processing, it will dry and shrink. And very often after that drying and shrinkage, at some point it's going to be planed to give it a uniform thickness and a smooth surface like we see in this 2x4. So 2x4 in this case for this softwood piece of structural lumber refers to the original dimension or the nominal dimension, where at the sawmill it would have been cut originally probably more or less 4 inches wide and 2 inches thick. But due to the shrinkage and then the subsequent shrinkage during drying and the subsequent planing, the finished dimensions or the actual dimensions of a 2x4 are going to be 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches. That's the reason. It's not a scam to try and call something bigger than it is. It has to do with the fact that there's the original rough nominal dimensions, rough green nominal, and then the finished dried plain dimensions. So 2x4s and 2x6s, you commonly hear that with softwood structural lumber. That's the original nominal dimension, even though the finished dimensions are less. And then in hardwood lumber, they will often refer to the original green rough dimensions expressed in quarters of an inch. So a 4/4 board would be 1 inch thick, rough green. And so if you're using that lumber and then you're going to make furniture, the finished dimensions after it's dried and planed will probably be on the order of 3/4 of an inch.